Stauber. And we're hearing from our Minnesota and Wisconsin lawmakers who will attend tonight and the guests they plan to bring. Northern News Now's Sophia Lauber spent this afternoon talking with them. Sophia, what'd you hear?
Well, some members are attending in celebration of the president's first few weeks, while others are attending in protest of actions he's taken. Trump is expected to speak on immigration, federal government cuts, tariffs on Canada, Mexico, and China, and the new move to pause military aid to Ukraine. Democratic Senator Tina Smith is one of many members of Congress who plan to use their guest invite to send a message. She's bringing Kate Severson, a Voyageurs National Park ranger from International Falls, who was fired as part of the federal government cuts. Smith says she's received well over 100,000 emails and calls from Minnesotans upset by the cuts.
Having Kate be a part of this joint address is a way of shining a light and helping to focus attention on the actual impact of these cuts on our communities in northern Minnesota.
Northland Republican Representative Pete Stauber, on the other hand, plans to signal his support of the Trump administration, bringing Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth's wife, as well as Duluth native and hockey legend Phil Vercoda as his guests.
I'm hoping to hear the president talk about his agenda that he promised the American people. He's going to talk about making America strong, prosperous, secure, and putting the American people first.
Stauber added he believes Trump will use tariffs to put the American people first, referencing steel tariffs from Trump's first term that he says kept the Iron Range open. When asked about Trump's move to pause funding to Ukraine, Stauber says he trusts the president's negotiations.
Thank you, Sophia. You can watch the joint address on Northern News Now starting at 8 o'clock. We'll have a full recap for you coming up at 10.